They said a stranger like her would never be allowed past the gate, but by nightfall she would be the only reason something precious in Jim Whitaker's life kept breathing. The morning dust hung low over the ranch, soft but suffocating, as Emily Carter stood barefoot at the edge of the Whitaker property, her clothes worn thin from travel and hands marked by miles she never explained. The iron gate between her and the world she needed felt heavier than wood or steel. It felt like judgment itself. Inside, Jim Whitaker watched her without moving, a man carved by years of loss and disappointment, his silence sharper than any refusal he could have spoken. He did not ask her name at first, only studied the way she held herself steady despite having nowhere else to go, the way her eyes refused to drop even when the world told her she did not belong. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no pleading drama, only exhaustion and truth, asking for work as if work was the last honest thing left in the world. Jim did not answer, not because he did not hear her, but because he had learned that words often cost more than they were worth. He turned away slowly, leaving the gate closed behind him, and in that quiet rejection something settled in the air like a final decision. Emily did not argue, did not knock again, did not raise her voice to chase what was already gone. Instead, she stepped back into the road, the dirt soft under her worn boots, and disappeared into the thin line of morning light that stretched across the ranch like a warning. Hours passed without change, the ranch moving in its ordinary rhythm, horses shifting in their pens, wind brushing through dry grass, the world pretending nothing was about to break. Then came the sound from the barn, not loud, but wrong in a way that made everything else feel distant. Jim stopped what he was doing before he even understood why, his instincts pulling him toward the back of the property where one of his finest horses lay weakened and still, the kind of animal that had carried more value than gold in these parts. The air inside the barn felt colder, heavier, and as Jim stepped through the doorway his eyes caught movement. Low to the ground, something too small to be one of his men, too steady to be a thief, too focused to be lost. It was Emily Carter, kneeling in the straw, her sleeves rolled back, hands working carefully with a simple thread she must have carried with her, as if the world outside had never told her she did not belong in a place like this. Jim's breath caught, not in anger, but in disbelief, because nothing about the moment made sense except the one thing he had been trained his whole life to ignore, that sometimes the people you turn away are the only ones who know how to save what you cannot afford to lose. Jim Whitaker stood at the entrance of the barn longer than he meant to, as if the air itself had turned heavier around the sight in front of him, and for a brief moment he forgot how to speak, or even why he had come here in the first place. Emily Carter did not look up at him immediately. Her focus remained steady, her hands moving with careful precision as if every motion carried a purpose that existed beyond explanation or permission. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of something unspoken, something that neither of them had the language to break without changing what was already happening. Jim's eyes shifted from her face to the horse and back again, trying to understand how a stranger who had been denied entry hours earlier now stood in the most important place on his land, as if she had always belonged there. He noticed the small details first, the worn fabric of her sleeves, the faint dust on her fingers, the way her breathing stayed calm, even under pressure. There was no hesitation in her work, only certainty, and that certainty unsettled him more than any argument could have. Emily finally paused, not because she was finished, but because she sensed his presence had reached the point where silence alone would no longer hold. She did not stand up fully, only turned slightly, enough to acknowledge him without surrendering her focus. Jim's voice came slowly, lower than usual, not shaped by authority, but by confusion and restraint. He asked her what she thought she was doing, though even as he asked it, he already saw pieces of the answer forming in front of him. Emily did not rush to defend herself. Instead, she explained in simple terms that the horse had been weakening for hours, and that waiting for someone else to decide what was worth saving would have been too late. Her words were not dramatic, not rehearsed, only direct, as if she were describing weather or distance rather than consequence. Jim stepped closer without realizing it, his boots pressing softly into the straw-covered ground, his attention pulled more by the condition of the animal than by his own questions. The horse shifted slightly, a subtle sign of life that caught his attention with quiet force. Emily continued working without breaking rhythm, her voice lower now, saying that sometimes damage was not about what could be seen, but about what was left ignored for too long. Jim felt something in her tone that he could not place, not authority, not pride, but something closer to responsibility, as if she carried an understanding of survival that did not require permission from anyone. He glanced toward the open doorway of the barn where morning light had begun to change into a warmer shade, and for the first time, he noticed how time had moved without asking either of them for approval. The ranch outside continued its usual rhythm, unaware of the shift happening inside this quiet space. But for Jim, the world had narrowed down to a single moment he did not know how to respond to. Emily finally set her hands down for a brief second, not in surrender, but in completion of a step, and looked at him fully. There was no expectation in her expression, no demand for recognition, only the calm certainty of someone who had already done what needed to be done regardless of outcome. Jim did not speak immediately, because for the first time in a long time, he was not sure what words were meant to do. Jim Whitaker remained standing near the stall door longer than he intended, as if stepping away would mean admitting something he was not yet ready to face, while Emily Carter returned her attention to the horse with a calm focus that seemed to shut out everything except the task in front of her. The barn was quiet in the way that only old wooden structures could be quiet, where every small sound carried meaning. The faint shifting of straw, the distant creak of timber adjusting to the morning heat, and the soft breathing of an animal slowly finding its way back from the edge of uncertainty. Jim watched without speaking, his eyes moving between Emily's steady hands and the animal that now responded in subtle ways that had not been there earlier, a deeper rhythm in its breathing, a more stable stance in its body. He did not understand how a person who had been turned away so easily could now be the center of something so delicate and important, and that confusion kept him rooted in place. Emily worked without urgency, as if she had all the time in the world and yet understood that every minute still mattered, her movements precise, deliberate, and careful, guided by a knowledge that did not require explanation. Jim finally stepped closer again, this time slower, as if testing whether the moment itself would allow him to approach without disrupting it. He asked her where she had learned something like this, not out of accusation, but out of genuine disbelief, because in his experience skills like this were either taught in structured places or earned through experiences people rarely spoke about. Emily paused only briefly, her hands still resting near the animal, and answered without looking up that she had learned from necessity, from places where waiting for help was never an option. Her voice carried no pride, only fact, as if survival had been her only instructor. Jim absorbed that quietly, feeling the weight of what she was not saying as much as what she was. The horse shifted again, this time with more control, and Emily adjusted her position slightly, guiding the movement with a calm assurance that suggested she understood the animal better than anyone else in the barn at that moment. Jim noticed how the tension in his own shoulders had not fully released, as though part of him still expected the situation to collapse back into doubt at any second. Outside, the ranch continued its normal rhythm, distant voices carrying faintly across the open land, but inside the barn time felt slower, almost suspended. Jim found himself thinking about the hours before, about the closed gate, about the decision he had made without hesitation, and how little he had considered what might exist beyond that boundary. Emily finally spoke again, saying that the horse was not finished yet, that it still had strength left if given the chance to use it properly. There was no guarantee in her words, only observation, and somehow that made them more convincing than any promise. Jim looked at her more carefully then, not as a stranger anymore, but as someone whose presence had already altered the direction of his morning in ways he had not anticipated. He noticed the way she remained steady even after long effort, the way she did not seek approval for what she had done, and the way she seemed entirely uninterested in proving anything at all. The barn door shifted slightly with a passing breeze, letting in a narrow line of sunlight that crossed the floor and touched both of them without distinction. In that moment, Jim realized the difference between watching and understanding, and for the first time since she had arrived, he did not feel like he was looking at a stranger who had entered his space, but at someone who had already changed it. The light inside the barn shifted as the morning advanced, turning the dust in the air into thin golden threads that moved slowly with every breath of wind that passed through the open doors, and Jim Whittaker found himself still standing in the same place, as if the floor beneath him had decided not to allow retreat. Emily Carter remained near the horse, but her focus was no longer only on the animal. It was also on the subtle changes in the space around it. The way the breathing had steadied, the way the tension in the body had softened into something closer to rest than struggle. Jim noticed that she was no longer working with urgency, only with maintenance, as if the critical moment had already passed without announcement. He finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, less shaped by authority and more by something uncertain that he did not yet recognize in himself. He asked her how long she had been moving from place to place before, arriving here, not because it mattered to the horse, but because it suddenly mattered to him in a way he did not expect. Emily hesitated only briefly, then answered that she had been traveling long enough that distance no longer felt like something counted in miles, but in chances that never stayed in one place long enough to become permanent. Jim absorbed that without interruption, his eyes drifting briefly toward her hands again, noticing small details he had overlooked before, the way they carried both strength and restraint, as if they had learned when to act and when to wait. Outside the barn, a ranch hand passed at a distance, slowing briefly when he saw movement inside, but continuing on without entering, leaving the moment contained within its own quiet boundary. The horse shifted its weight again, this time more naturally, and Emily stepped back slightly to give it space, her expression unchanged, not satisfied, not relieved, only attentive. Jim found himself realizing that he had been measuring the situation from the wrong direction since the beginning, thinking of what he had allowed rather than what had already been done. He asked her why she had not left after being turned away, and Emily answered without looking at him directly that leaving would have meant accepting that the outcome had already been decided by someone who had not seen what needed to be seen. The simplicity of her response lingered in the air longer than expected, as if it required no further explanation to carry its meaning. Jim turned his attention fully to the horse then, noticing how stable its stance had become compared to earlier, how the breathing no longer carried the uneven rhythm that had brought him into the barn in the first place. A strange awareness began to form in him, not sudden, but gradual, that what he had witnessed was not an interruption of his morning, but a correction to something he had failed to understand. Emily finally stood up fully, stepping back from the animal with careful movement, as if ensuring that nothing she had done would be undone by haste. Jim did not speak immediately, because for the first time since she had arrived, he was not thinking about what had happened, but about what it meant that he had almost prevented it from happening at all. The barn felt different now, not changed in structure, but in weight, as if the space itself had absorbed something that could not be reversed. Emily looked toward the open doorway where the ranch stretched outward under the rising sun, and for a brief moment the silence between them carried less uncertainty than before, as if both of them understood that something irreversible had already taken place, though neither of them had yet decided what to call it. The barn door remained open as the morning continued to rise, and the light outside grew stronger, stretching across the ranch in long, quiet lines that made everything look unchanged at first glance, even though something essential inside Jim Whittaker had already shifted without permission or warning. Emily Carter stood a few steps away from the stall now, her attention no longer fixed only on the horse but on the space between them, as if she understood that what had just happened was not the end of a task but the beginning of a question neither of them had agreed to ask out loud. Jim finally moved, not quickly, but with a slow awareness that felt unfamiliar to him, like he was learning how to exist in a moment where certainty no longer came first. He looked at the horse again, noticing the steadier breathing, the calmer posture, and something in his expression softened in a way he did not try to hide, but also did not fully understand. Emily adjusted the sleeve of her coat, a small gesture that suggested fatigue more than discomfort, and Jim noticed for the first time how long she must have been awake, how far she must have come before ever reaching his gate. He asked her again, this time not about skill or purpose, but about why she chose to step inside when she could have continued walking past and never looked back. Emily paused, as if considering whether the answer needed words at all, then said that some things do not feel like choices when you see them suffering in front of you. only responsibilities that do not wait for permission. The simplicity of her answer left no space for argument, and Jim found himself looking down briefly, as if the ground might offer a clearer explanation than the air between them. Outside the barn, a distant wind moved through the open fields, carrying the scent of dry grass and dust that belonged to this land as much as anything permanent ever could. Jim stepped closer to the stall again, not to inspect, but to confirm what his eyes were already telling him, that the horse was no longer in the condition it had been when he first entered. There was no dramatic transformation, no sudden miracle that demanded attention, only a steady return to balance that felt almost quiet enough to be overlooked if not watched closely. Emily followed his gaze without speaking, giving him the space to come to his own understanding, though it was clear she had already reached hers. Jim finally spoke her name for the first time, testing it in a way that suggested he was trying to place her somewhere in the structure of his world, though it did not fit any category he had prepared for. She responded simply, without correction or expectation. A ranch hand passed again outside, this time slowing longer, noticing Jim inside with a stranger, but still choosing not to enter, as if sensing that whatever was happening did not belong to interruption. The barn felt less like a place of work now and more like a threshold between decisions already made and decisions still forming. Jim looked at Emily more carefully then, not with suspicion, but with a kind of recognition he did not yet want to name, as if he had just realized that the most important changes in his life had not always announced themselves loudly. Emily met his gaze briefly, then looked back toward the open light beyond the barn, where the day was continuing without pause, indifferent to the small shifts that had already altered the direction of everything inside. Jim Whitaker stood longer than necessary near the stall, as if staying still could help him understand the strange shift that had taken place inside his own land and inside his own judgment. The barn no longer felt like a place defined only by work and routine, but something quieter, something heavier with meaning he had not invited. Emily Carter remained near the open space beside the horse, not holding herself as someone who had achieved anything final, but as someone who understood that care was never a single moment, only a series of quiet decisions that continued after no one was watching. Jim finally broke the silence, not with authority, but with a tone that carried hesitation he was not used to hearing in his own voice. He asked her where she would go next, as if expecting her presence to be temporary, like weather that passes without leaving evidence behind. Emily looked toward the doorway for a long moment before answering, her eyes reflecting the open land beyond the barn, saying that she would go wherever work existed that did not depend on being believed first. The simplicity of her answer made Jim realize how little he actually knew about the people who passed through his gates, not because they were invisible, but because he had never taken the time to see them beyond their need. Outside, the ranch continued its slow morning rhythm, horses being tended in the distance, the sound of boots on dry ground, the familiar structure of a place that believed itself stable. Inside the barn, however, something had shifted in a way that could not be measured by routine. Jim stepped closer to the horse again, placing his hand lightly against the wooden frame of the stall, noticing how the animal now stood with a steadiness that had not been there before Emily entered. He did not speak immediately, as if afraid that words might reduce what he was beginning to understand into something smaller than it was. Emily adjusted her position slightly, preparing to leave her place near the animal, but not in a way that suggested departure was urgent, more like someone waiting for permission that she did not expect to receive. Jim finally asked her why she had not asked for payment or recognition after what she had done, and the question carried more weight than he intended, because it revealed more about him than about her. Emily paused again, then said that not everything that holds value needs to be traded in order to be real, and some actions exist only to restore what should not have been lost in the first place. Jim absorbed those words without reply, feeling the discomfort of realizing how often his own world had been built around transactions rather than understanding. A distant sound from outside drifted into the barn, the normal life of the ranch continuing as if nothing important had changed, but Jim knew that something had already moved into place that could not easily be undone. He looked at Emily more directly now, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had already left an impression on something he considered his responsibility. For a brief moment, Neither of them spoke, and in that silence Jim understood that the decision forming in front of him was not about the horse anymore, but about what kind of person he had been before she arrived and what kind of person he might become after she left. Jim Whittaker did not move for a long time after the last words were spoken, as if the weight of them required more than just hearing. It required acceptance, and acceptance was something he had never been good at when it came without warning. The barn around them remained unchanged in structure, yet every detail now felt slightly different. The angle of the light, the sound of distant movement across the ranch, even the quiet breathing of the horse seemed to exist in a calmer rhythm than before. Emily Carter stood near the stall but no longer touched anything, her presence now more like someone waiting for a moment to be acknowledged rather than someone trying to prove a point. Jim finally exhaled slowly, his eyes shifting from the horse to Emily, and then briefly toward the open doorway where the land stretched outward without boundaries or expectations. He asked her, in a lower voice than before, whether she ever stayed in one place long enough for people to remember her name, not as a challenge, but as a question that came from a place of curiosity he was not used to expressing. Emily answered after a pause that she had learned early that being remembered was not always connected to being safe, and that sometimes moving on was the only way to keep what little dignity remained intact. The words stayed in the air longer than expected, not because they were complex, but because they were honest in a way that did not invite argument. Jim looked down briefly, processing something that did not fit neatly into the way he had always understood people who came and went through his land. The horse shifted slightly again, and Emily instinctively adjusted her attention, not out of obligation, but out of habit, as if caring for something fragile had become part of how she moved through the world. Jim noticed that instinct and found himself thinking about all the times he had mistaken silence for absence or distance for lack of value. Outside, the ranch continued its slow motion of daily labor, but the barn felt separated from that rhythm, as if it existed in a narrower space where only certain truths were allowed to settle. Jim stepped a little closer to the stall, then stopped again, unsure whether he was observing or participating in something that had already changed direction without his permission. He finally spoke again, asking her if she would have done the same thing if she had known she would not be welcomed inside, and the question revealed more about his thinking than he intended. Emily did not answer immediately, and when she did, she said that knowing the outcome never mattered as much as recognizing what was in front of her at the moment it needed attention. Jim absorbed that quietly, realizing that his own decisions had often been shaped more by outcome than by presence. For a brief time, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was no longer uncertain, but reflective, as if both were beginning to understand that the barn had become more than a place of work or chance. It had become a point where two different ways of seeing the world had crossed without warning and could no longer fully separate in the same way again. Jim Whittaker stood with his hands resting lightly on the wooden edge of the stall, though he was no longer truly focused on the structure in front of him, but on the slow realization forming in his mind that something irreversible had already taken place inside his own judgment. The barn was quieter now, not in emptiness, but in balance, as if the earlier tension had been replaced by a fragile steadiness that required attention rather than correction. Emily Carter remained nearby, not stepping forward or backward, simply existing in a space that no longer felt like it belonged solely to Jim or to the ranch, but to the moment itself. Jim finally broke the silence again, his voice lower than before, carrying less authority and more uncertainty, asking her what she expected to happen next, as if trying to place her future into a structure he could understand. Emily looked toward the open barn door for a long moment, where sunlight stretched across the ground in pale lines, and she answered that she did not expect anything, because expectation often led to disappointment, and she had learned to move without building assumptions around outcomes. Jim absorbed that quietly, realizing how often his own life had been shaped by expectations that left little room for anything unexpected to enter without being judged first. The horse shifted again, this time calmly, and both of them instinctively glanced toward it at the same time, sharing a brief moment of unspoken acknowledgement that something fragile had been brought back into stability without ceremony or recognition. Jim stepped slightly away from the stall, as if needing distance to think clearly, and his gaze drifted across the barn interior, noticing details he had overlooked for years: the worn wood, the uneven light, the quiet persistence of a place that had always functioned without asking for attention. Emily adjusted her coat lightly, not preparing to leave immediately, but no longer anchored to a task that required her constant focus. And Jim found himself wondering how many times she had entered spaces like this without ever being invited to stay. He asked her, more carefully this time, if she had ever considered settling somewhere instead of continuing to move from place to place. And the question carried less curiosity and more an unspoken attempt to understand whether permanence was something she avoided or simply never received. Emily paused before answering, and when she did, she said that settling only made sense when a place recognized you before you had to prove your worth inside it, and that had rarely happened in her experience. The simplicity of her words settled into the space between them, not as argument, but as observation shaped by repetition. Jim looked toward the open barn door again, where the ranch stretched outward into the morning distance, and for the first time he considered how many people might have passed through his land without ever being seen in a way that matched their actual worth. The realization did not arrive with emotion, but with clarity, quiet and steady, like something that had always been there, but had never been named. Emily finally turned slightly toward the exit, not as a signal of departure, but as a natural response to time continuing forward, and Jim did not stop her, because something in him understood that what had occurred inside this barn was not an event to be completed, but a change that would continue to unfold long after both of them had moved on from standing in the same place. The morning had fully settled over Jim Whitaker's ranch, but the barn still carried the feeling of something unresolved, as if the air itself remembered what had just taken place and was not ready to release it. Jim stood near the open stall for a long moment after Emily Carter had shifted her attention toward the exit, his eyes no longer fixed on any single object, but moving slowly across the space as though searching for a way to organize thoughts that refused to align neatly. The horse remained calm, standing with a steadiness that had not existed earlier, and that simple fact continued to echo in Jim's mind more than anything else. Emily had not moved far. She was still within the barn, but now closer to the threshold where light from outside poured in, drawing a faint outline around her figure. Jim noticed how she did not rush toward leaving, nor did she linger with expectation, but instead occupied a space that felt temporary without being uncertain. He finally spoke again, asking her not about where she would go, but whether she had ever been offered a place where she did not need to justify her presence before being allowed to stay. Emily paused at that question longer than before, as if it touched something she rarely allowed herself to examine. And then she answered that most places she had known required proof before welcome, and by the time proof was given, the need for welcome had already passed. The words settled into the quiet barn without resistance, and Jim found himself thinking less about what she had done for the horse, and more about how many times she must have been measured before being understood. A ranch hand moved in the distance outside, briefly visible through the open doorway, but did not enter, continuing along his path as if the barn held a boundary that could not be crossed without reason. Jim stepped slowly toward the center of the barn, his boots pressing softly into the straw-covered ground, and for the first time he was not thinking about ownership or responsibility, but about recognition and how easily it could be withheld without intention. He asked Emily if she ever expected people to understand her work when she moved on, and the question sounded different even to him as he spoke it, less like judgment and more like curiosity shaped by uncertainty. Emily looked toward him briefly, then back toward the open fields beyond the barn, and said that understanding was never something she expected, only something that sometimes followed after silence had already done its work. Jim felt a quiet discomfort in that answer, not because it was unclear, but because it reflected a truth he had not previously allowed himself to consider. The horse shifted once more, grounding the moment in something physical and present, and both of them instinctively turned their attention toward it again, sharing a brief acknowledgement that what mattered most in that space was no longer tension or control, but continuity. Jim realized then that the barn no longer felt like a place where something had been fixed, but like a place where something had been revealed, something that would continue to exist even after Emily left and the day moved forward into its ordinary shape. Emily finally stepped closer to the doorway, not rushing, not hesitating, simply allowing movement to follow its natural direction, and Jim did not stop her, because for the first time he understood that what had changed inside his ranch was not dependent on whether she stayed, but on the fact that she had already been there at all. By the time Emily Carter reached the threshold of the barn, the light outside had fully changed into late morning brightness, and the ranch had begun to settle into its normal rhythm again, as if nothing unusual had disrupted its order, even though everything inside Jim Whittaker had already shifted into a quieter and more reflective state. Jim stood behind her for a moment without speaking, watching the way she paused just before stepping fully into the open air, as if acknowledging that leaving a place could sometimes carry more weight than entering it. The horse remained steady in its stall, breathing evenly, no longer showing any sign of the earlier struggle that had drawn both of them into this shared moment. A ranch hand passed in the distance again, this time closer to the barn, slowing briefly as if considering whether to approach, but continuing on when he saw Jim standing there without calling out or giving instruction. The space between Jim and Emily felt different now, not tense, not uncertain, but quietly defined by something neither of them had named yet. Jim finally spoke her name again, not as a question, but as acknowledgement, and Emily turned slightly back toward him, her expression calm, not expecting anything from the moment that followed. He asked her, with less hesitation than before, whether she would continue traveling through places like his, fixing what others overlooked, and then leaving before being asked to stay. Emily did not answer immediately, and when she did, her voice carried a steady acceptance that suggested she had long since stopped measuring her life by permanence. She said that she did not choose places based on whether she would stay, but on whether something needed attention while she was there, and that was enough for her to keep moving forward. Jim listened without interruption, realizing that her understanding of purpose was not tied to ownership, belonging, or recognition, but to presence in moments that required action without expectation of return. The barn behind them felt quieter now, not because sound had changed, but because meaning had shifted away from urgency and into reflection. Jim stepped slightly closer to the doorway, his eyes following the open land beyond, noticing how the ranch continued its routine without pause, indifferent to the small but significant change that had taken place inside his perspective. He asked her if she ever felt the need to explain herself to the people she helped, and Emily answered that explanation was only necessary when people had already decided not to understand. The simplicity of her words carried more weight than argument, and Jim found himself accepting that truth without resistance. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them no longer felt like distance, but like recognition of something that did not require further definition. Emily finally stepped fully into the sunlight outside the barn, her figure briefly outlined against the open field, and Jim remained where he was, not stopping her, not calling her back, only watching as she moved forward with the same steady pace she had carried from the beginning. In that final moment, he understood that nothing about what had happened inside the barn was temporary, even if her presence was, because some encounters did not end when someone left. They continued to exist in the way a person saw the world afterward, and for Jim Whittaker, that change had already begun. The afternoon light had shifted again by the time Jim Whittaker remained alone near the barn entrance, and the ranch around him continued its steady rhythm as if nothing unusual had occurred, yet he no longer experienced the space in the same way he had only hours earlier. The horse stood calmly in its stall, now fully settled, breathing in a way that suggested stability rather than uncertainty, and that simple reality lingered in Jim's thoughts longer than any conversation that had taken place that morning. He found himself replaying small moments without intention, the quiet way Emily Carter had worked, the absence of hesitation in her movements, and the way she had spoken about things that others usually avoided naming. Outside, distant activity from the ranch carried on, boots moving across dry ground, voices exchanging routine instructions, the familiar structure of work continuing without interruption, yet Jim felt slightly removed from it, as if something inside his perception had been adjusted without warning. He stepped back into the barn once more, not because he needed to confirm anything, but because he felt a quiet pull toward the place where everything had changed without announcement. The stall felt different now, not physically, but in the way memory had begun to settle into it. as if the space itself had absorbed the presence of someone who was no longer there. Jim placed a hand briefly on the wooden frame, then let it rest there without pressure, noticing how ordinary it looked again, even though it no longer felt ordinary to him. A ranch hand passed outside and glanced in, noticing Jim standing alone, but did not enter or interrupt, continuing on with his work as the day moved forward. Jim finally stepped outside into the open air, where the sunlight was brighter now, and the ranch stretched out with its usual sense of distance and familiarity, yet his attention remained divided between the present moment and the memory of what had occurred earlier. He began walking slowly across the yard, not toward any specific task, but simply moving as if motion itself might help him organize thoughts that were still forming without structure. He thought about Emily Carter again, not in terms of where she had gone, but in terms of what remained after her presence had already left the space she occupied. There was no visible sign of her now, no trace of her footsteps beyond the normal wear of the ground, yet her absence felt different from the absence of someone who had never been there. Jim paused near the edge of the yard, looking out across the open land, where the horizon remained unchanged and steady, and for the first time that day, he considered how many moments in his life had passed without him noticing their significance until after they were gone. The ranch continued its normal rhythm around him, but his understanding of it had shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to change how he would see it moving forward. In that quiet realization, Jim Whittaker did not feel closure, only awareness, and that awareness remained with him as the afternoon continued, marking the beginning of a change that had no clear end point, only direction. The evening light had begun to settle over Jim Whittaker's ranch, stretching long shadows across the yard and softening the edges of everything it touched, yet Jim remained standing near the open space between the barn and the main house, as if the day had not fully released him from what it had already changed. The horse in the barn remained calm and steady, now fully recovered in appearance, and that quiet stability continued to sit in Jim's mind like a thought that refused to fade into the background of ordinary work. He did not feel urgency anymore, only reflection, as though the ranch itself had become slightly unfamiliar even though nothing visible had changed. He walked slowly across the yard again, passing familiar structures that now seemed to carry a different weight, not because they had altered, but because his awareness of them had. The wind moved gently through the open land, carrying dust and warmth, and the sound of distant ranch activity continued in its usual rhythm, but Jim found himself noticing it differently, as if he were hearing it for the first time without the filter of habit. He paused near the fence line where the property opened toward the wider fields, and looked outward without focusing on any single point, allowing his thoughts to settle into a quiet understanding that had been forming since the morning. Emily Carter was no longer on the ranch, and there was no expectation that she would return, yet her presence remained in a way that did not depend on physical proximity. Jim realized that nothing she had done required recognition to remain significant, and that realization carried a weight he did not immediately try to define. A ranch hand approached at a distance, slowing briefly as if waiting for instruction, but Jim simply nodded without speaking, signaling continuation rather than interruption, and the man moved on without question. The ranch continued to function, as it always had, but Jim's attention kept returning to the barn, not because of obligation, but because something within that space had shifted the way he understood responsibility itself. He thought about the way Emily had spoken, not with demand or expectation, but with clarity that did not seek agreement, and how that kind of clarity was rare in a place where most interactions were shaped by need or authority. Jim turned slightly back toward the barn, watching the open doorway where sunlight still entered at an angle that marked the passage of the afternoon, and for a moment he stood still, not as a man overseeing his land, but as someone reconsidering how he had always seen the people who passed through it. There was no dramatic conclusion forming in his mind, no sudden resolution, only a steady recognition that what had happened earlier was not an isolated event, but something that would continue to influence how he made decisions moving forward. The ranch remained unchanged in structure, yet Jim Whittaker understood that his perspective within it had already begun to shift, and that shift would not reverse simply because the day continued toward evening. In that quiet awareness, he stood alone, not with certainty, but with a new kind of attention that would stay with him longer than the moment that created it. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the wide horizon when Jim Whittaker returned to the barn one last time that evening. Not because anything called him there, but because something in him refused to let the day end without understanding what it had changed inside him. The air was cooler now, carrying the quiet weight of a ranch settling into night, where distant sounds softened and every structure seemed to rest after a long day of labor. The horse stood calmly in its stall, fully recovered, breathing in a steady rhythm that no longer carried uncertainty, and Jim paused there longer than he intended, as if confirming once again that what had happened was real and not something his mind had constructed out of reflection. He placed his hand